Hi, everyone. This is a summary of Yayun Kao's article, What's in It for Me? And it's about egoism and ethical egoism. And I will provide a link to it in the description down below. So she's concerned in this article with this question primarily. What exactly is the relationship between ethics and self-interest? And so she's going to consider three different theories. The first one is psychological egoism, which actually isn't a theory of ethics at all. It's more of a theory of human nature or human psychology. The second one is ethical egoism, which is a theory of ethics, and social contract theory, which is also a theory of ethics. But first, let's start with psychological egoism. So psychological egoism is a theory of human nature that explains human behavior in terms of self-interest. Why do we do what we do? Because it serves our purposes and our own interests. In other words, she says, altruism is nothing but an illusion. What is altruism? It's acting for the sake of others. It's doing something for somebody else's sake. She thinks, well, the psychological egoist thinks that that's an illusion. But you may say, I know lots of good people in the world who do a lot of good things. The psychological egoist would say, no, what you think they're doing, they're acting for the sake of others. But really, if you really understood their motivations, you would see there was some explanation in terms of self-interest, that they're basically selfish like all of us. Now, that might be hard to accept, so let's go ahead and consider some other viewpoints in this section. She quotes from Max Stirner here, who says, quote, "For me, you are nothing but my food. Even as I too am fed upon and in turn used by you, we have only one relation to each other, and that is of usableness, of utility, of use. We owe each other nothing. For what I seem to owe you, I owe at most to myself." So that's a pretty dark view, don't you think? If I just value you because of your usefulness to me, that's doesn't seem very ethical, to say the least. Nonetheless, she says, the author says that there's a major objection to be had here, to be given against psychological egoism, and that is that the theory is non-falsifiable. What is a non-falsifiable theory? Well, that's one that if you can't falsify it, you can't prove it. And if you can't prove it, then you really have a meaningless theory. At least that's what we philosophers like to say. So that's a problem with the theory. Now, was there an example of this? Let me see. If you can, let's say you think of one of those kind people in your life, or you think of the heroes that you've heard of, like some soldier in a foxhole who jumps on a grenade to save his buddies. Now, that seems like a great example of an altruistic action, right? If there ever was one. But a psychological egoist would interpret this action through the lenses of self-interest and would probably tell a story like this. It looks like that person's a hero, but in fact, they're just acting selfishly because their whole life, their goal was to grow up and become a hero so that people would tell their story for generations to come. Now, that seems to be an example of a non-falsifiable theory if there ever was one. Even as clear a counterexample as that, of this soldier jumping on a hand grenade, would not qualify as something that would not undermine the theory. We really got to ask whether this is a meaningful theory at all. Okay, let's move on to ethical egoism. The ethical egoist goes further than the psychological egoist, saying that not only do we act out of our own self-interest, but we ought to, or we should pursue our own self-interest as well. She here cites Adam Smith. She says, quotes, he famously argues for egoism as a practical ideal in economics. Each business person promoting their best interest would most effectively promote the common good, given that the, quote, invisible hand, or the free market, would coordinate individual economic activities. And she goes on to give the example of a sporting event or some sort of competitive athletic event where you've got these two teams that are in competition with one another, and that competition drives them to work harder. It brings out the best in them, and it makes the whole event more enjoyable for all of us. Now, that may work out well in the realm of business, that may work out well in the realm of sports and athletics, but is that a good model for the whole of life? That's the question that we need to ask as we're considering this as an ethical theory. Now, there's another objection here or concern, that is with Adam Smith's point. She mentions this down below, but if Adam Smith is after the common good or the greater good, that doesn't seem like something that ethical egoism can establish, right? It doesn't seem to have the resources to justify an action in terms of the public good or the common good. Because remember, ethical egoism is about the self. What is right is what is good for oneself. It's not clear at all that you can bring in or smuggle in these concerns about the common good. Okay, she also mentions the philosopher Ayn Rand, who's also about egoism. She says that selfishness is a virtue. I'll go ahead and just skip through that for the sake of time. She thinks, however, the biggest challenge to ethical egoism is that it lacks authoritative regulation of interpersonal conflicts of interest. So if you have a conflict of interest, you would hope that your moral theory could help you solve it. But she thinks that ethical egoism cannot do that, so it suffers as a moral theory. Her example is one in which she says her grandfather has included her in his will, but is thinking of writing her out of it. So it might be in her own self-interest to go ahead and kill him now so that she can get the money, right? But clearly that's not in his interest. But if you got this conflict of interest, then what does your moral theory say? Well, if your moral theory is ethical egoism, there's no resolution, there's no way to solve it. That's a problem for ethical egoism. So maybe it ought to be rejected. Okay, let's go ahead and skip down to the section on social contract theory. So of these theories of egoism, this is probably the best one or the most plausible one. And she says, social contract theory shares the core assumption of egoism that we are self-interested and rational agents. However, realizing that living together in a society requires a set of rules for social cooperation, social contract theory provides a justification for why we should coordinate with others. So in other words, this is like an enlightened egoism. It realizes that if I'm going to get what I want, I've got to cooperate with others. And so let's go ahead and create this social contract where we all give up some of our own rights and our own interests in order to be happier overall. She mentions three philosophers here. I'm just going to focus on two of them. The first one is Thomas Hobbes. And in his Leviathan, he talks about a state of nature. This is a pre-political natural state of humanity, which he says, quote, is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Because in this pre-political natural state, where basically humanity is just in the woods and fighting it out, trying to battle over these scarce resources. Think of it, this is what I think of. I think of like an episode of The Walking Dead, where, humanity, there's only a few people left and they're all out to, survive, and they're killing each other along the way. It's very sad, very scary. Nobody wants to live that way. Even in the TV series, they form communities and basically they have these social contracts so that they can survive, right? So that's the basis of the social contract. It is self-interest and survival. That's why we form societies. Now, she says here, quote, Hobbes's social contract theory claims that moral requirements are nothing but social convention that we as rational and self-interested agents agree upon for the sake of survival. Now there's one more social contract theory that I want to mention that she brings up here, and that is John Rawls. She says he develops a social contract theory that answers the question, what terms of cooperation would free and equal citizens agree to under fair conditions? And so the difference here between Hobbes and Rawls is that Hobbes is about escaping the state of nature out of survival, and Rawls is about imagine this free, unbiased situation called the original position, where citizens or policymakers are behind this veil of ignorance. They don't know their nationality, they don't know their religion, they don't know their wealth or their physical talents, and they're required to come to some agreement on the policies that are going to govern their society. And they won't know what place they take in society, they won't know how much they are making. And presumably, he says, the policies they make are going to be unbiased and fair for everyone because they don't know their own, biases. So, yeah, that's a good stopping point, I think. Rawls's theory is really relevant today. We can apply it to all kinds of ethical cases, especially ones that are political or deal with distributive justice. I hope you found that helpful.